We're back for another episode of The Governance Voice. My name is Letricia Fullerton, Manager of Special Projects, Administration, and Education, and I'll be your moderator for today. Each month, we explore relevant and important governance topics. Each broadcast, we hope to equip you and other governance professionals to support, guide, and influence their boards and organizations. Today, we are sitting down with Natalie Giroux, President of Stratford Intellectual Property. Natalie leads Stratford Intellectual Property IP Agency. In 2021, Natalie ranked on the IAM Strategy 3000 Global List for leading IP strategists. With over 25 years of industry experience, she'll be drawing from her expertise in strategic IP management, technical due diligence. We will offer a handout for this session that will highlight the main learnings for the session. Please see the link in the show notes for the resource. Please see the link in the show notes for that resource or visit our governance library. Natalie, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Now, I know you're passionate about IP, and our listeners are very excited to learn more about this topic. So let's get right into it. So for those of us who don't know about intellectual property, what is it?
So intellectual property, or IP, refers to creations of the mind, such as functional invention, literary or artistic works, designs, symbols, names, images, and also transformations of data that provide a competitive advantage in the commerce. But IP refers to more than patents. It also refers to trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, and industrial designs, which most companies, even service companies and non-for-profit organizations, should be thinking about.
Okay, all right, thank you. So with that said, why should governance professionals and other board members be aware of intellectual property strategy?
Well, although IP is intangible, it's one of the most valuable assets on a company's balance sheet. IP should positively impact valuation during financing and exit transactions, but it's often forgotten. Also, from a governance perspective, there's several risks related to IP that could negatively impact a company. The first is the risk to lose or disclose IP before it's adequately protected, either by inadvertent disclosure of employees who are not aware of the importance of IP or by theft. The second risk, which is mostly known, relates to infringement claims, being either frivolous or not. But both risks could severely impact the company's success and possibly shut it down. This is why governance professionals need to ensure the company has a solid IP strategy and is implementing it proactively.
Okay, so are there any new trends or challenges of intellectual properties on the horizon for 2022?
So last year, the Ontario government issued a report on intellectual property, and basically the recommendation was the need to raise IP literacies amongst entrepreneurs. The key recommendation is that all executives in a company need to know what they need to know in order to ask the right questions and avoid costly, irreparable mistakes. So they're pushing for more training and encouraging all entrepreneurs to learn enough of IP strategy to not make mistakes. In parallel, ISO, the International Standard Organization, recently released a standard on innovation, specifically IP management and IP strategy, which highlights the importance of IP for companies. So just both these two factors seem to show a trend that IP literacy and proper IP management will become more and more important for companies.
Okay, all right. So then how often should IP be discussed at board meetings?
Well, at a first meeting, the company should present its complete holistic IP strategy, and board members should ensure that all the key aspects are covered. And again, an IP strategy is not just, we have filed a few patents or we have a trademark. It's much more than that.
Mhm.
And then the company should, at each board member should update if there's any change to the IP strategy or any progress, and basically show that it's implementing proactively and intentionally its IP strategy on an ongoing basis. So the board should ensure that an executive of the company is accountable for the IP strategy to make sure that it is actually happening. The board members want to make sure the IP strategy is not on the back burner, it's being acted on, and it's not an afterthought. So as often as needed, board members should ask proper questions to make sure things are moving along. So depending on the level and pace of innovation in the company, progress on the implementation of the strategy could be reviewed biannually or even quarterly, but definitely should be a regular topic on an agenda. And as part of normal finance discussions at the board, the IP budget should be reviewed to ensure there's sufficient funds allocated for upcoming events in the IP strategy. I often see companies that invest in IP early on, but they forget to budget enough money for the next steps with the IP registration, and they have to abandon the assets early, which is unfortunate.
Okay. All right. So what would be the first steps in developing the strategy? Like as a board who's never done this, because I'm sure there's some boards out there that don't even have an IP strategy. What would be the first steps?
So a good IP strategy is based on the short and long-term business objectives. So the current stage of funding, expected fundraising, exit strategy. So the idea is to build the IP strategy with the end in mind. First, the organization need to audit their current IP strategy. So do they have existing patents and trademarks? How are they handling trade secrets and all that? But there's 5 main pillars of an IP strategy: IP awareness and processes, IP portfolio growth, how you're going to plan the growth of your IP portfolio management, how you're going to manage the files so that they're due diligence ready, how you're going to use patent databases to build industry intelligence and monitor what your competitors are doing. And finally, think proactively about monetization opportunities for your IP portfolio. So the different types of IP have to be considered, not just patents again, and not just trademarks. Those are the 2 easy ones. So how can the company benefit from all the types of IP and what risks are associated with them? So these are all need to be considered in the IP strategy.
Okay, and sorry, just one question just to go off of that. You mentioned it a couple of times, trade secrets. How does that differ from the IP strategy or a patent? What is a trade secret?
So a trade secret is a type of intellectual property that protects functional invention or any information about the company that benefits the company by being secret. Okay. So think about the Coca-Cola recipe, for example. It's been kept secret. The company has taken steps so that it would never be revealed as a whole. Okay. And it's been forever the competitive advantage of Coca-Cola.
Okay.
As opposed to a patent, when you file a patent application, you must disclose the best mode of how your invention works, such that someone skilled in the art can replicate it. And 18 months later, this disclosure becomes public and available around the world. And you're only protected in the countries that you filed for protection. As a comparison with trade secrets, as long as it's kept secret, you have worldwide perpetual protection, and there's no expiry date to it. There's benefits and there's advantages and disadvantages to patents and trade secrets, but both are extremely valuable, and companies should really take the time to evaluate the pros and cons before making decisions to just going to file a patent. Okay. And that's really some considerations that companies are often forgetting, the idea of trade secrets. Data compilations, data transformations, and derived data, which is hugely valuable for SaaS companies, for example, those
Right.
also definitely benefit from trade secret protection.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. Good. I learned something new. Thank you. Thank you. So how often can organizations ensure, implement, and effectively use consistent IP processes?
So for each of the pillars I mentioned earlier, there's
Mhm.
different processes that are required. So
Okay.
IP awareness and IP disclosure processes are just a few examples, but the company must ensure that all employments and contractor agreements have proper IP assignment clauses from day one. I often see founders filing a patent with both names as an inventor, and they don't even bother doing contractual IP clauses. And at some point, one of the founder leaves and refuses to sign any further documents, and the IP assets have to be abandoned. So that's contractor employment agreements are really important. Reviewing patent landscapes relevant to existing and future products are also important. Reviewing the patenting activity of existing competitors and making
Right.
sure they're not doing anything wrong. Registering, marking, monitoring key trademarks, implementing a policy around use of open source software. So these are all just examples of processes that should be part of an IP strategy and implemented on an ongoing manner, but there's a lot more to it.
But what were the risks involved for the governance professionals or the board members or even the organizations?
So there's several risks. The first one is the risk to lose valuable IP before it's protected. So employees doing inadvertent public disclosures or putting a product out that has really good innovation without filing for patents,
Right.
things like that. So at one point, you're no longer allowed to file for patent protection. In some countries, as soon as you've done a public disclosure, you're barred from patenting. So that is a huge risk.
Okay.
Also, there's a risk that trade secrets are not properly cataloged so that the company doesn't take the time to have proper disclosure process internally to catalog trade secret. This way, there is a risk that the value of the IP is not maximized to investors and acquirers as well. And another risk, for example, is the use of open source software, which so many companies don't take time to think about. So open source software is a Pandora box of issues. And if the company doesn't have an intentional policy around which communities to use and what communities can mix in their software, there's a risk that software created can be in conflict of copyright licenses, which could hinder potential investments or acquisitions in the future. There's always a risk of infringement, like I mentioned earlier. So even from non-practicing entities or what we call sometimes patent troll or even a competitor. So the IP strategy needs to include proactive measures to develop contingency plans and ensure proper indemnification from suppliers and all that. So another really important risk to be mindful of is losing the rights or not having the rights to use its brand after it's established. So companies may forget about establishing key trademarks and registering them. And at the time of registration, it's too late and they have to rebrand when all their customers really know them by their name. And losing the brand is a huge risk as well.
Wow. Okay. So bottom line, do your research. Do your research. Okay. In the resource that you're sharing with us, you mentioned a comprehensive due diligence ready summary of all company-owned IP. That was huge. It's a mouthful. What would you be able to walk us through the process or walk us through that whole process?
Sure. So the company should start by maintaining an up-to-date database of all the files related to each type of IP it owns. Filing receipts, sign assignments, annuity payments, power of attorney, and all that. By the time any due diligence starts, it's too late to organize things. And often investors or potential acquirers will judge the company's management team by how well their IP files are in order. Sometimes it could even derail negotiations. I've seen deals go sideways because assignments were not properly organized, and the company had to run around trying to assign assignments after the fact with employees that are gone, which was really difficult. So keeping Excel spreadsheets, simple Excel spreadsheets with summary of IP by type, by status, by country, assigning IP to product lines so that the investors and acquirers can see a relationship between the IP and the products. That's also very important. And then keeping a summary of the current IP strategy, policies, and processes available for due diligence. So there's a lot of things that need to be done. The key takeaway is that a company should maintain it up to date as opposed to do a last minute rush to put it together. I've mentioned a few times cataloging trade secrets. That's something that should be done on an ongoing basis. By the time of due diligence, it's too late. And I would say 50% of the valuable trade secret will be forgotten at that stage.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Another big question, cybersecurity is a huge concern for a lot of organizations now. And how can a governance professional and board members ensure that the appropriate cybersecurity measures are in place to protect IP?
So companies should do a cybersecurity audit and make sure that all required systems and processes are in place to prevent IP theft and data leaks. And that should be done by experts in cybersecurity. You want to make sure that employees that are working from home these days have secure systems, so they're working through secure Wi-Fi, but also have secured communication links to any server. So a software designer is not uploading precious software to a server through just an unsecured communication channel. So spending money on VPNs and secured communication channels is really important because anyone could extract the software before it makes it to a safe place. And the key is to repeat these audits regularly, maybe twice a year, and to make sure that all the systems are upgraded to anything state-of-the-art that's required. Like I said before, once IP is disclosed, if it's not protected by patents, the value will be considerably diminished. So it's really important not to lose it.
Awesome. Okay. So that was a lot, but a lot of good information. Is there any final words of wisdom or anything that you haven't shared with us already that would be pressing for that board or for the governance professional to get started with this process?
Yeah, so I realize IP is a daunting and complicated field. As a board member, you don't need to know everything about IP, but you should make sure that the executive team understands enough that they know what question to ask and how to identify IP experts and professionals that they can work with to maximize the value of the portfolio and minimize the risk. And that's the key. So again, just working with professionals that look beyond filing patents and trademark, but looks at the whole picture that I discussed today. So other takeaways is IP is not only for tech companies, as I mentioned, it's for service companies, even nonprofit organizations that may be using software. Any companies has a brand, so it starts there, making sure that the brand is well protected. So as I said as well, there should be an executive on the board or reporting to the board that is accountable for proactively implementing the IP strategy and changing the strategy as the business evolves, because it changes through the different stages of the company. So, and finally, the company should partner with firms that can help them design and implement this holistic, pragmatic IP strategy to maximize value.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie. And yes, there's been a lot of great information here, so I hope that everyone can take this and make good use of it. So it was a pleasure speaking with you today and sitting down and picking your brain with all these questions. We also want to thank our listeners for their support. And don't forget to check our show notes for the handout with a lot of useful information. If you enjoyed this chat, please feel free to like the episode and follow our podcast. If you think someone would benefit from this episode as well, please feel free to share it along with the other episodes that we have. If you need to get more information about Natalie Giroux and the intellectual property, we will have more information in the show notes for this episode. So to learn more about that and about Governance Professionals of Canada, please visit our website at www.gpcanada.org. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Natalie, again.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Take care, everyone.